In 1945, the British Empire covered a quarter of the globe. It ruled over 700 million people. It had just defeated Nazi Germany in the most devastating war in human history. And it was completely, utterly, and irreversibly broke. Not struggling. Not in a tight spot. Broke. The treasury was empty. The gold was gone. The overseas investments had been sold off. And the country that had saved the world from fascism could not afford to buy enough wheat to feed its own people. The nation that bankrupted Britain was not Germany. It was the United States. This is the story of how America dismantled the British Empire, not with soldiers, but with dollars, loans, and the cold logic of compound interest. To understand how the wealthiest empire in history went bankrupt, you have to understand the cost of fighting a total war. When World War II began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial giant. It held billions of dollars in gold reserves. British citizens owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and vast industrial concerns across the United States. The City of London was the hub of global insurance, shipping, and banking. But the war that Hitler launched consumed resources at a rate that defied all pre-war calculations. It was a war of machines. It devoured steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber. And Britain had to import almost everything. The problem was the law. The United States was officially neutral in 1939. Congress had passed the Neutrality Acts, which included a specific clause known as cash and carry. This law stated that belligerent nations like Britain could buy American supplies, but they had to pay in cash immediately, and they had to transport them on their own ships. There would be no loans. There would be no credit. The Americans were happy to sell the weapons of war, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before the crates left the dock. For the first year of the war, Britain drained its treasury to meet these demands. In a secret operation known as Operation Fish, the British government loaded the entire gold wealth of the nation onto battleships and ocean liners and shipped it across the dangerous Atlantic to vaults in Canada. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities were sent into exile to pay the American bill. By late 1940, the gold was gone. The liquid cash was gone. Winston Churchill wrote one of the most important letters of his life to President Franklin Roosevelt, performing what he later described as a delicate and humiliating dance. He had to tell the leader of the world's richest neutral nation that Great Britain, the banker of the 19th century, the empire that had defeated Napoleon, was completely broke. Roosevelt understood the stakes. He knew that if Britain fell, America would be next. But he also needed to sell the war effort to the American taxpayer. He invented a concept called Lend-Lease and explained it with a folksy analogy about lending your neighbor a garden hose when his house is on fire. It sounded generous. It sounded neighborly. But behind closed doors, the reality was entirely different. It was not a conversation between neighbors. It was a foreclosure proceeding. The American Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, demanded a full audit of the British Empire before releasing a single dollar of aid. He wanted to see every asset owned by the British government and every asset owned by private British citizens anywhere in the world. He wanted to make sure Britain had stripped itself of everything before American taxpayers subsidized the war. The most painful example was the American Viscose Corporation, a massive industrial giant owned by a British company. Morgenthau identified it as a target and gave the British an ultimatum. Sell it or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. The company was worth over $100 million. It was sold under duress for roughly $54 million. It was a fire sale, and the dollars went straight into the U.S. Treasury. But it was not just industrial assets. Roosevelt demanded 99-year leases on a string of British naval and air bases across the Atlantic, from Newfoundland to Trinidad, in exchange for 50 old destroyers that were barely seaworthy. Britain traded a century of strategic positioning for a handful of rusting ships. The United States was absorbing the wealth and the geopolitical infrastructure of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. The Lend-Lease agreement also contained a clause known as Article 7. It was written in dense diplomatic language, but it contained a poison pill. Britain agreed to dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. This was the network of tariffs that favored trade between Britain and its colonies. It was the economic wall that held the empire together. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own defenses and open its empire to American exporters. The British negotiators knew what they were signing, but the German bombers were overhead and the cash was gone. They had no choice. When the war ended in August 1945, the British expected a soft landing. They expected Lend-Lease to continue during the transition to peace. They were wrong. 7 days after Japan surrendered, President Truman signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease immediately. Ships loaded with supplies bound for Britain were ordered to turn around in the middle of the Atlantic. The lifeline was severed without warning. Britain was importing half its food and almost all its raw materials. Without Lend-Lease dollars, the country faced immediate bankruptcy. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, called it a financial Dunkirk. He boarded a ship for Washington, sick and exhausted, to beg for help. He believed Britain had a moral case. He planned to argue that because Britain had fought alone against Hitler for 2 years while America remained neutral, the United States should give Britain a grant, not a loan, as retroactive payment for holding the line. The Americans refused. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan of $3.75 billion, and it came with devastating conditions. The most poisonous was sterling convertibility. Within 1 year of receiving the loan, Britain had to make the pound sterling fully convertible into dollars. The Americans knew exactly what would happen. The moment the window opened in July 1947, the world rushed to sell pounds and buy dollars. The loan money evaporated in 5 weeks. Britain was forced to suspend convertibility in humiliation. The financial weapon had worked perfectly, but the final blow came not in the 1940s, but in 1956. The Suez Crisis was the moment the United States proved it could destroy what remained of British power with a single phone call. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which was jointly owned by British and French interests. The canal was the lifeline of the empire, the shortcut to India and the oil fields of the Middle East. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to retake it. Militarily, the operation was a success. The canal zone was secured within days. Then Eisenhower made his move. He did not send troops. He did not fire a missile. He deployed 3 financial strikes. First, he blocked the International Monetary Fund from providing Britain with $561 million in standby credit. Second, he blocked the Export-Import Bank from extending $600 million in credit. Third, and most devastatingly, he ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to prepare to dump America's holdings of British sterling bonds. The effect was immediate. Sterling was already under speculative pressure. The threat from Washington tipped the weakness into panic. The Bank of England lost over $200 million in reserves in November 1956 alone. Britain's total foreign currency reserves had fallen to just over $2 billion. The Chancellor of the Exchequer told the Prime Minister that within weeks the country would be unable to import sufficient food and energy. Britain was being starved into submission by its closest ally. Prime Minister Anthony Eden had no choice. He accepted a ceasefire. British and French troops withdrew in humiliation. The Suez Canal remained under Egyptian control. Eden resigned shortly after, his health and his career destroyed. The British Empire, which had projected power across the globe for 2 centuries, had been brought to heel by a phone call from the U.S. Treasury. Not a shot was fired between the 2 allies. The weapon was purely financial. The aftermath was irreversible. In the mid-1950s, sterling still accounted for nearly half of global reserves. Within a decade, the dollar held twice sterling's share. In 1967, Britain was forced to devalue the pound by 14%. It never recovered its status as the world's reserve currency. The empire dissolved. India was already independent. The African colonies followed. The bases were handed over. The trade preferences were dismantled. Britain went from ruling a quarter of the planet to struggling to keep the lights on during the winter of 1947. And the debt lingered. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was not a gift. It was a commercial obligation with interest. Every year for 6 decades, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Through the boom of the 1950s, the recession of the 1970s, the Thatcher years, and the Blair years, the payments continued. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. 61 years after the victory parades, British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II. The United States did not conquer the British Empire with armies. It bought it. It acquired the assets, the bases, the trade routes, and the geopolitical influence in a series of distressed transactions managed by the U.S. Treasury. Lend-Lease stripped the industrial wealth. Article 7 stripped the trade protections. The 1946 loan stripped the currency. And Suez stripped the dignity. Each stage was presented as help. Each stage was conditional. And each condition transferred power from London to Washington. The story of how the United States bankrupted Britain is not a story of villainy. The Americans did help save Britain from Hitler. The aid was real. The supplies were essential. Without Lend-Lease, the Nazis might have starved the British Isles into submission. But the terms of that aid were designed to serve American interests as much as British survival. The United States emerged from the war with the world's largest economy, 2/3 of the world's gold, and a network of military bases that had once belonged to the British. Britain emerged as a debtor nation that would spend the next 60 years writing checks to its rescuer. The special relationship was never a partnership of equals. It was a transaction. And the receipt is still in the filing cabinet, dated December 29, 2006, stamped paid in full.